Stannis's hand closed around my wrist hard enough to bruise, right there among 200 masked guests who had no idea what they were watching. "You are wearing a dead woman's name," he said, low, only for me, "and I intend to make certain everyone in this hall learns exactly whose it actually is." "Let go of her," said a voice from behind him, quiet and absolutely certain, and I felt the entire crowded hall shift its attention before I even turned to see who had spoken. King Einar stood there in his own unmasked face, having removed it the moment he crossed the floor toward us, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me every single evening since I arrived, except this time he said the one thing I had spent 4 days waiting and dreading to hear him say aloud. "Corva," he said, my real name, in front of the entire ballroom, step away from him. I did not know yet whether 4 days of borrowed silence had bought me enough protection to survive what came next. I only knew I was done pretending to be anyone else. Let me tell you how I ended up in that ballroom. Because it started 4 days earlier, in a dead woman's traveling coat, learning to answer to a name that was not mine. I was 23, and I had spent the previous 8 months learning exactly how far a person can run from a man who believes he still owns her. Stannis had claimed me 2 years before that, formally, before both our families and half our village, and had spent every month since teaching me, in small and increasingly unbearable ways, exactly what claiming actually meant to him. I will not describe all of it here. I will say only that the night I finally ran, I did not look back, and I have not once regretted the decision, whatever it has cost me since. I had lived under 3 different names in 8 months, moving between villages that asked few questions of a quiet seamstress, willing to work for modest pay. I learned to keep my belongings light enough to abandon at a moment's notice, to avoid conversations that lingered too long on my past, to flinch less visibly whenever a stranger's voice carried the wrong particular timbre. I heard, through a network of women who had learned to pass warnings quietly among themselves, that Stannis had never stopped searching, that his reach extended further into the border territories than most fleeing women could outrun. I heard, too, that King Einar of the Northern Territories held a formal audience each year during his mating ball, the one occasion when any unclaimed Omega, regardless of station, could petition him directly, in person, for protection or redress the ordinary channels of court might otherwise deny her. I had tried twice to reach him through those ordinary channels. Both attempts had been quietly turned aside by officials I now suspected were not entirely unconnected to Stannis's considerable reach. The ball itself required an invitation, sealed and formally issued, that I did not have and had no legitimate way to obtain. I did, however, have Ilsa. Ilsa had been a friend from my second village, a gentle woman who died of a fever 3 weeks before the ball, her own invitation arriving in the post 2 days after her death, addressed to a woman who would never open it. I had sat with her mother twice in the days after the funeral, bringing what small comforts I could, and it was on the second visit that the invitation, still sealed on the mantel, caught my eye and would not let it go. Her mother, grieving and kind, gave it to me herself when I explained, as honestly as I dared, why I needed it more than the dead deserved to be honored by an empty chair. I traveled to Einar's territory in Ilsa's own good traveling coat, practiced her signature until my hand ached, and prepared myself to answer to a name that was not mine for as long as the ball required it. I stood in the queue outside Einar's gates for the better part of an hour, watching finely dressed women present their invitations ahead of me, feeling increasingly certain that mine would be the one the guards finally looked at closely enough to question. My hands did not stop shaking until the guard waved me through without a second glance. And even then, the relief lasted only as far as the receiving line itself. The gate guards did not question the invitation closely. Masked balls, I would learn, trade in a particular kind of anonymity even before the masks themselves go on, and a properly sealed invitation carries considerably more weight than a guard's careful scrutiny of the face presenting it. I did not expect King Einar's reaction the moment I crossed his threshold. He was not masked yet himself, standing near the receiving line greeting each arrival with the practiced formality of a king who has performed this particular ritual many times before, and something in his face changed the instant his eyes found mine. Not confusion, not suspicion exactly, but a flicker of recognition so immediate and so total that I very nearly turned and walked back out the door, before he had finished his formal greeting. "Welcome," he said, to the room at large, and to me considerably quieter, in a voice only I was close enough to hear, "Ilsa." He knew. I understood it in that single syllable, in the particular careful weight he placed on a name he clearly did not believe belonged to me. I do not know, even now, exactly how he knew, whether it was scent or instinct, or some quieter certainty his wolf carried that no disguise could fool. I only knew, standing in that receiving line with my heart hammering, that the one man in that entire hall capable of unmasking me in front of 200 witnesses had just chosen, deliberately, not to. I moved through the rest of that evening in a state of careful, controlled panic, certain each moment would be the one in which he finally said something further. He did not. He simply watched me, from across the hall, with an attention I found considerably more unsettling than outright accusation would have been. I danced twice that evening, both times with minor lords who asked polite, harmless questions about a life I had to invent on the spot. Drawing on the little Ilsa's mother had told me of her daughter's few remaining relatives and imagined preferences. I found the performance exhausting in a way ordinary conversation never was. Every sentence, a small calculation of what a dead woman would plausibly have said. Once, midway through a particularly tedious exchange about a distant cousin's wedding, I caught Einar watching me from across the room, and something in his expression, amused almost, beneath the careful formality, nearly broke my composure entirely. He found me alone near the terrace doors well past midnight, once the crowd had thinned enough for a private word to pass unnoticed. "You are not Ilsa," he said, quiet, not unkind. "I do not know who you actually are. I would like to, if you are willing to tell me, though I will not force the question if you are not. I could have lied further." I found, standing there in a dead woman's coat with a king, who had already seen through it entirely, that I did not particularly want to. "Corva," I said. "My name is Corva." Something in his face eased slightly at hearing it, as though the truth itself were a small relief after 4 hours of careful pretending. "Why the disguise, Corva? This ball is open to any unclaimed Omega who wishes to petition me. You did not need a dead woman's invitation to reach me honestly." "I tried the honest channels twice," I said. "Both attempts were quietly turned aside before they ever reached your ear. I have learned, this past year, that some men have influence enough to close doors I cannot see closing." Something in his jaw tightened. "Whose influence?" I hesitated, the old fear closing around my throat, even in the relative safety of that quiet terrace. "I am not ready to say the name yet. I would ask you not to press me on it tonight." "Then I will not press," he said. "I would only ask that you let me keep your secret a little longer myself, until you are ready to stop needing one." We stood together at the terrace railing a while longer, the ball's music drifting faintly through the doors behind us, and I found myself, for the first time in 8 months, simply breathing rather than calculating my next careful move. "You have not asked me a single question about Ilsa herself," I said eventually. "Most men in your position would want to know exactly whose name they were being deceived with." "I am considerably less interested in the dead woman's name than in the living one standing in front of me, he said. I will grieve her loss if you would like to tell me about her properly sometime, but tonight I find I only have room to worry about you. I did not know what to say to that kind of plain, uncomplicated concern, so I said nothing at all, and let the quiet hold it the way I would learn. Over the following days, most true things between us liked to be held. I remained at Einar's territory considerably longer than the ball itself accounted for, because he offered, quietly, once the formal petitioning hours arrived the following morning, to hear my grievance properly and in full, and because I found, once I finally trusted him enough to speak the whole truth aloud, that I was not ready to simply disappear back into another borrowed name the moment the telling was finished. I told him everything, in the privacy of his own study, rather than the ball's crowded audience hour, Stannis's claim, the 2 years that followed it, the 8 months of running under names that were never mine. It was the first time I had said the whole of it aloud, start to finish, without softening any piece of it for the listener's comfort, and I found the telling considerably harder than I expected, my voice catching more than once on details I had spent months trying not to remember too vividly. He listened without interrupting, something in his composure going very still and very careful as the account went on, and when I finished, he was quiet a long moment. I am sorry, he said finally, that the honest channels failed you twice before you ever had to resort to a dead woman's invitation to reach me at all. That is a failure of my own court, and I intend to find out exactly how far his influence has reached into it. You are not angry that I lied my way through your own gate. I am considerably more interested in why you needed to, he said, than in the lie itself. A woman does not borrow a dead friend's name and practice her signature until her hand aches, unless the alternative frightens her more than the deception does. I did not know what to do with that particular understanding, so I told him, plainly, the one thing I had not yet said aloud to anyone since I ran. I am tired of being someone else. I would like, very much, to simply be Corva again, somewhere Stannis cannot reach. Then let us make certain of it properly, he said, rather than simply letting you vanish into a fourth borrowed name the moment this audience ends. If you want to find out whether Stannis ever actually found me at that ball, and what Einar's wolf did the moment my real name finally mattered more than my careful disguise, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king chooses silence as protection rather than exposure as convenience. Lachlan, once informed of the full situation, moved quickly and quietly, cross-referencing every petition my honest attempts had generated against the officials who had handled them, and found, within 2 days, exactly the pattern I had suspected. A clerk in the outer offices with considerable unexplained debts, recently settled, coinciding precisely with the dates my earlier petitions had mysteriously failed to reach the king's own desk. He has been paying to keep you from Einar's ear, Lachlan said grimly. Which means he has known, for some time, that you were somewhere in these territories, simply not exactly where. That same afternoon, word reached us from Ilsa's own village that a man matching Stannis's description had visited her mother's cottage, asking pointed questions about her daughter's death and whether the invitation issued for the ball had ever actually been used. Her mother, frightened but composed, had told him nothing beyond the plain truth that her daughter was dead and buried, and he had left with a warning that he intended to confirm the matter himself. I understood, hearing it, that I had inadvertently put a grieving woman in danger simply by borrowing her daughter's name, and the guilt of that sat considerably heavier on me than my own fear did. Word reached us on the 3rd day that Stannis himself had arrived at the edge of the territory, ostensibly to attend the ball's final formal evening as an invited neighboring lord. Though I understood, hearing the news, that his invitation had likely been secured through the very influence Lachlan had just uncovered. He is coming for the ball itself, I said, my voice considerably steadier than I felt. He suspects I am here. Then we will not let him find you unprepared, Einar said, his jaw set in the particular way I had come to recognize as a decision already made. I did not leave the territory, though every careful instinct I had built over 8 months of running told me to. I stayed, because Einar asked me to trust him with whatever came next, and because I found, somewhere in those 2 days, that I was simply tired of running from a man who had already taken enough of my life without also taking my last chance at safety. I did not sleep well the night before that final evening. I lay awake turning over every version of what might happen, certain that whatever plan Einar and Lachlan had built between them could not possibly account for every way a man like Stannis might choose to make a scene. Einar found me in the corridor before dawn, unable to sleep himself, and sat with me a while without demanding conversation, the same steady presence he had offered since the terrace. "You do not have to attend tonight," he said quietly. "I would understand if you preferred to wait this out somewhere safer." "I have spent 8 months waiting things out somewhere safer," I said. "I am tired of it. I would rather be in the room when this finally ends than hiding from the ending itself." He did not argue the point further. He simply nodded, and I understood that he had expected exactly that answer, and had asked only to be certain I still meant it. The final evening of the ball arrived with the particular tension of a storm not yet broken. I wore my paper mask again, plainer than every other guest's finely painted one, and moved through the crowd with Einar never quite out of sight. Though he did not hover so obviously that anyone would suspect the arrangement, I felt him before I saw him, some old instinct honed over 2 miserable years, recognizing the particular weight of his attention across a crowded room before my eyes ever confirmed it. I told myself I had time to reach Einar, or Lachlan, or any of the guards positioned discreetly around the hall's edges. I did not have quite as much time as I had hoped. Stannis found me an hour before midnight, in a quieter corner of the hall where I had stepped away to catch my breath. And I understood, the moment his hand closed around my wrist, that 4 days of careful preparation had not been quite careful enough. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this. His grip, his voice, low and certain that he had finally cornered me, and then Einar's voice, cutting through the crowd's oblivious noise, calling me by the one name I had spent 8 months afraid to answer to in public. "Corva," he said again. Once he had crossed the last of the distance between us, his own mask discarded somewhere along the way, step away from him. Stannis did not release me immediately, some old, familiar defiance flaring in his face at being addressed so plainly by a king he had clearly hoped to outmaneuver quietly. "This is a private matter between myself and my intended," he said. "I would ask your grace not to interfere in a claim formally settled 2 years ago. A claim is not formal when it was never freely given," Einar said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous. "And I have spent the last 2 days gathering considerably more evidence of exactly how you have treated this woman than you would like a full court to examine. Release her, or I will let my own wolf explain to you, considerably less politely than I am currently managing, why that grip is about to become a very serious mistake." Stannis released me. I do not think he had a choice, watching whatever moved behind Einar's careful composure in that moment. My wrist ached where his grip had been, and I found, standing free of it at last with an entire hall watching, that I did not feel the old paralyzing fear I had carried through 2 years of his claim. I felt, instead, something considerably closer to fury, finally given somewhere safe to land. Lachlan arrived with enough of the castle guard to make certain the confrontation ended there, and it was in front of that same crowded hall, every masked guest now considerably less interested in their own conversations than in the scene unfolding at its edge, that Einar finally said, plainly, exactly what 4 days of careful silence had been protecting. "This woman came to my ball under a dead friend's name," he said to the assembled crowd. because the honest path to my protection had been quietly closed to her by influence I intend to fully expose. She is not Ilsa. She is Corva, and she is, as of this moment, under the full protection of this crown, regardless of what claim any man in this hall believes he still holds over her. The hall did not laugh, the way I had half feared it might. It went the particular silent, attentive stillness of a crowd finally understanding the shape of a story it had only glimpsed in pieces. Stannis was formally detained that same night, his invitation revoked, his corrupted influence in Einar's outer offices exposed within the week through Lachlan's continuing investigation. The formal dissolution of his claim over me, expedited through the Crown's own authority once the full truth of the original claiming's coercion came before the Council, was granted before the season's end. I did not attend the Council session where the dissolution was formally read aloud. I had said everything I needed to say to that particular chapter of my life already, and I found I had no interest in reliving it a second time for an audience of strangers, however sympathetic they might have been. Word of the confrontation spread through the Northern Territories faster than any formal announcement could have managed, and I received, in the weeks that followed, several careful letters from women I had never met, asking, in language I recognized instantly, whether Einar's court truly offered the protection the rumors claimed. I answered every one of them myself. Einar found me afterward on that same terrace, holding the plain paper mask I had worn through both evenings, considerably less fine than any other guest's, but the only one that had ever actually protected me. I have spent 4 days trying to prove to you that you did not need to keep pretending, even with me, he said. I do not think nearly losing you to him in my own ballroom was the demonstration I had intended. It worked anyway, I said, though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it. He looked at the mask still in my hands, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its careful, guarded formality. I do not know how to properly court a woman I first met wearing a dead friend's name. I only know I have not wanted to stop learning her real one since. You already learned it, I said, the moment I walked through your door. That is the only thing you ever needed to do. When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 4 days protecting a secret rather than exploiting it, I felt something in my chest, some old, exhausted vigilance I had carried since the night I first ran. Finally, quietly, settle. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had watched a stranger in a dead woman's coat become, by the end of one turbulent ball, considerably more than anyone in that hall had expected. Lachlan stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in weeks, entirely unworried. I invited Ilsa's mother to the ceremony herself, and watched her weep quietly through most of it, telling me afterward that she had not expected, when she handed a stranger her dead daughter's invitation, that the gesture would eventually end in a coronation. I told her the invitation had done considerably more than get me through a gate. It had given me the one chance I needed to stop running at all, and I did not think there was any way to properly repay a debt that large, beyond simply living well with what it had bought me. 6 months later, I stood on that same terrace with a letter from Ilsa's mother in one hand and my plain paper mask, carefully preserved now, in the other. Her letter thanked me for finally writing to tell her how her daughter's invitation had been used, and said she considered it, in her own words, the finest thing that borrowed name had ever accomplished. I wrote back that I intended to keep the mask for the rest of my life, exactly as plain as it had always been. Lachlan had stopped bracing every time Stannis's name came up in court proceedings. Mostly, now that the man sat formally stripped of his own territory's standing, his corruption of Einar's outer offices laid bare before the full council. Einar had, at my own insistence, revised the ball's petition process entirely, so that no future Omega seeking his protection would ever again need a dead friend's name to reach him honestly. And his court, once so accustomed to formal masks and careful distance, had quietly gotten used to the sight of their king's queen wearing the plainest, least remarkable mask in any room, precisely because she had never needed a finer one to be seen. I had also, in those 6 months, begun quietly corresponding with 2 other women who had written to the crown under circumstances uncomfortably similar to my own, offering what guidance I could from my own 8 months of learning how to run, and, eventually, how to stop. Einar never once asked me to take on that work formally. I simply found I could not turn away from a letter that reminded me so clearly of my own handwriting on Ilse's borrowed invitation, and he made certain, without ever being asked twice, that I always had the resources to answer properly. Einar's wolf, for its part, had never entirely lost the habit it developed that first evening of watching me from across any crowded room. A quiet vigilance I no longer found unsettling in the slightest. I had come to understand it, over those months, not as suspicion, but as the same steady attention that had first recognized me through a dead woman's name, and had simply never seen a reason to stop. I turned the paper mask over in my hands and thought about the woman who had practiced a dead friend's signature until her own hand ached, certain of nothing except that she could not keep running under names that were never hers. She had no idea, that first anxious evening, that the king who saw through her disguise instantly was about to become the reason she never needed one again. She only knew she was tired of answering to anyone else's name. I like to think she would be glad now that she finally got to keep her own. Do you think Einar knew the moment I walked through that gate, or was it only once he heard my voice that he understood the mask covered someone entirely different than the invitation claimed? Tell me your theory in the comments, and if you want to stay at this ball a little longer, comment the mask, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing at that gate with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Einar's territory. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills who see straight through a careful disguise and choose, every time, to protect it rather than expose it, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.